Okay, very good. So now we have the synthesis panel. I mean, of course, we have a very serious task to make some sense of what we have done over the last 3 days. I mean, just as a kind of a reminder, we had 400 participants in this 3-day event, representing 200 organizations working on climate smart agriculture, representing 60 countries. And of course, we did a lot. I mean, we had keynotes and side events. We had hard talk and we had speed talks. I mean, we had hot topics discussions and we had hot seats. I mean, the Dragon Den. We played together the Beethoven 9th Symphony and we got ourselves into a chicken fight. We had the conference and we had the unconference. So a lot of different activities, and I think the objective of this synthesis panel is to draw a few lessons and kind of takeaways, I mean, from all those very dynamic events that took place and the discussions. We're not going to be, pretending to be comprehensive here. We're going to be very selective, and I have a few questions for the panelists, which already have been introduced by the facilitator. And the first. And at the end, so be ready for that. I mean, there will also actually be questions for the audience to which you can respond as well and provide input into this synthesis. The first question I have relates to the main takeaways from the thematic sessions. We had 6 teams, and of course our panelists, participated in various of those thematic sessions. So can you indicate a little bit the main impressions from the thematic sessions that you attended? I mean, what made you really excited? Andrew, you want to start?
Thanks, Martien. Well, firstly, can I just say a little word as one of the sponsors of the conference? From a sponsor's point of view, I think we've had excellent value for money. So I'm sure everyone here has their own individual impression of the conference, but just you reminding us of that rich menu of different types of events that have occurred over this 3 days. It has absolutely not been a normal conference, and from our point of view as a sponsor, it's been extremely good value. And wearing my other hat as a member of the System Council of CGIAR, I think a big tick for the CCAFS people as well, playing a really important integrative role across the CG system, and I think this conference has illustrated that extremely well. So over and above the themes, personally I've been absolutely delighted with the richness of the conference, and I think it's a testimony to some really good thinking behind and planning the different types of events and how that was going to play out. So from that point of view, it's been fantastic.
Okay. Bess, I mean, what are your impressions of the thematic sessions that you attended, and what did you get excited about?
Yeah. Thanks, Martien. Good afternoon, everybody. Before I go to the themes, I would like to express my gratitude to be to this conference, and among the event that I attended, I really like the Tajin debate. So it's something quite new to me, to everybody, but it's so interactive, and the way the moderator, the guy, what's the name is, Andy or something, it's really making people into the conversation. That's really good. Okay, let's go back to my the thematic session. So I actually, Martien, went to different rooms until late evening, until 17:30 yesterday, 18:30 yesterday. And to my point of view, the most attractive one is the theme 1, which is farmer empowerment, yeah, something like that, with the finance. I think since I'm from Indonesia, everything has to be funded by the government. So if there's some finance that goes to the farmers to make the CSA practices in in place, maybe there should be a way to do that without any hesitating from the farmer. Because in Indonesia, 90% of the agricultural activities are by the smallholder farmers. That's why we really need to think about them, consider about them, how they can make the high productivity without growing into more GHG emission. Thank you.
So farmers' voice really critical. Over to you.
Thanks, Martien. What gets me excited is the question, and I'm just wondering whether I get excited or I get frustrated. I think my excitement really is coming from some of the frustrations that I normally get when I work with researchers, because it seems that we don't speak the same language. I represent farmers' organizations, and indirectly I represent farmers. I tend to think that building on not only the thematic sessions, but also on the general sort of discussions, that we're a bit too scientific in terms of hard sciences, in terms of the way we look at things. And quite often we tend to ignore, in my view, the behavioral side of things, where the farmer is sitting. And naturally, because scientists will be presenting more of the technical evidence, I tend to be looking at things from the other side. And what gets me excited is the kind of robust debates and discussions that I'm involved in, that I get myself engaging with in the course of the thematic sessions, and indeed where there's a chance also in the plenary sessions. But what is also fundamentally important for me is I think going back a few years and up to now, I can see the gap between my own views and my own understanding of the situation on the ground and those of researchers narrowing a little bit. But I'm hoping that it will continue to narrow so that we begin to see things from the same sort of sense, so to speak. That is a positive thing. But generally speaking, I think the different flavors of thematic sessions, very informative. A lot of them I did not know about the perspectives, but some of them I knew about the perspectives, but a lot of them I completely disagreed with them. But in my view, I also had quite a bit of learning experience. In as much as my views, I hopefully think that they also fed into the knowledge systems of others.
Okay, thanks, Ishmael. So the next topic I want to put on the table, and I go back a little bit at the introduction that Bruce made at the opening day, who was saying that when it comes to food systems and SDGs, that we are kind of not on track actually to kind of achieve the relevant SDGs that are related to food systems. Poverty reduction, for instance, the rate of poverty reduction has halved, since 10, 15, 20 years ago. So the real question is whether eliminating absolute poverty can be achieved by 2030. We've seen the latest hunger numbers going up the last 3-4 years or so, as reported by FAO and other institutions. So questions about SDG 2. Bruce was calling for the need for urgency, and all the speakers as well. There are only 11 cropping seasons left. A big call for transformative change. Recognizes that business as usual is not sufficient and will not be, business as usual will not be able to reach the targets. And also the need for action, and bold action and going to scale. I think the word scale was mentioned a lot. So that's kind of my second question here for the panel. With all this talk on scaling, would there be any takeaways, from the sessions that you attended? And did you kind of also identify any levers for transformational change that you think would be worth sharing with the audience here? Andrew.
That'd be an interesting one to see if there's any insights coming out of the audience too. I guess I came in with the thinking that in general you need government for scaling up and generally you need private sector for scaling out, although that's not necessarily the case. In the private sector plays different roles in different contexts. But I didn't hear anything radically different or new around scaling, but others may well have in the audience. And for me, this notion of transformative change, coming from someone who's looked at agricultural extension research, where we're more comfortable with incremental change or with adjusting farming systems, the idea of completely changing farming systems or moving to something radically different, that doesn't lend itself to our traditional extension thinking. Mm-hmm. And so I'm worried, I think there might be something sort of internally inconsistent with the idea of planned transformative change. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I just think maybe our expectations are completely unrealistic, this notion that we can suddenly in a systemic, studied, coordinated way deliver radical transformations of a system. Almost by definition, things are going to happen in a chaotic, unexpected, surprising fashion. And the only other reflection is that quite often if we think 1 year ahead or 2 years ahead, everything feels slow. Mm-hmm. But when we look back 10 years, we seem to have come a long way.
Exactly. And
so you always overestimate what you can achieve in 1 year and underestimate what you can achieve in a decade. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to tweak our planning horizons to recognise that sort of prism that we tend to look through.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Andrew. Bess, any reflections from you on that? And picking up on Andrew's point, if there would be any suggestions from the audience on scale, I mean, after Bess and Ishmael have spoken, if you have any suggestions, be ready actually to share them with the audience. Bess.
Okay, thank you, Martien. Pointing out what Andrew already mentioned, so I also put like extension service is in number one. And then also that thing has to be needed by the farmers and support. Really the farmers really want to have them. And then the other one is the infrastructure. That is like something like infrastructure needed for that to be scaling up. And the next one is the good organization or institutional relation. So it's for the government until the district and sub-district, farmers group, or maybe also the NGO that maybe play a role on scaling up. I think that's my point of view.
Thank you, Martien. I think transformation has to, in my view, start with those that do the action on the ground. And if you're talking of agriculture and talking of farming, then it has to be transformative to the farmer. It has to make a meaningful change in their lives, improvement, which is significant. And for that to happen, in different ways, in different areas, in large numbers, I think there need to be better incomes and better rewards for the services that farmers are rendering, not only in terms of the crops and livestock they're growing, but also in terms of the ecosystem service, sort of custodianship that they play. So I think a fair reward, which is providing a decent quality of life, is going to enable many farmers to practice that which is needed on a large scale. That's the first point. The second point really is, if you're talking of scaling up, I think our ambition levels, in view of the enormity of the problem, should be much higher than what we're talking about. We're talking about a coverage which is very high, both geographically and in terms of numbers. And to do that, you need the infrastructure that enables you to reach to as many people as quickly as possible at the lowest cost and as fast as possible. In my view, digital solutions or digital platforms as a method of scaling up has got enormous potential that is still to be exploited. And I think we need to invest more in harnessing that reach that digital services can provide for scaling up. That's the first point. The second point really is, I think, another area which is also very impactful at the lowest cost, maybe not as fast as possible, is the area of policies. Just having right policies and right incentives within the policy, fiscal and monetary policy, is fundamental. By merely tweaking, for example, with VAT on CSA-related goods, you could affect as many people who are in the marketplace as possible. So really we also need to look at the extent to which we can harvest the potential for policy to reach as wide a number of people as possible. So those two areas, and complemented with the last area, which is really focusing on the future. The future is belonging to the new generation of farmers. If we don't begin to inculcate the practices that we are talking about in the new generation of farmers, it is going to be very difficult. So we need to reach out to as many as possible new generation of farmers. As long as it is speaking more to their pockets, I'm sure they will be able to go in as much as possible in their large numbers.
Thank you very much, Ishmael. So any suggestions from the room here? Any further ideas about how we can scale up? I mean, you've heard a few ideas and takeaways from the panel, but of what I said, you know, I mean, we are not going to be totally comprehensive here. So this is open for all the suggestions and key messages that you think, I mean, should be taken into account when the final minutes are made of this conference. So who wants to provide some inputs here? Don't be shy. Yes, over there.
Yeah, my name is Eva Dubois from CSIR Ghana. The last session before now, the one organized by the Catholic Relief Service, I think the take-home message at that level, we were looking at the scale also. At what level would you consider that you are really reaching out to scale? And we came out with the issue of behavioral changes that need to happen for us to really say that we are getting to scale. So the things that need to be transformed as we move ahead. If it's about soil and water management, what is it that farmers would need to do to bring about that transformation? If it's about natural resource management, what is it that all of us would have to do to bring about that transformation? So it's not just from the plot scale to a regional scale or to a global scale. We need to look at the behavioral patterns that need to change. And that is the pathway that we can use to really get to scale. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we need to mainstream the language, going beyond climate change, talk about soil and water management, which also, you get a listening ear for farmers as well as you discuss those issues rather than climate change. Any other points? I see a hand over there.
Hello? Yeah, I just wanted to share some takeaways that I had from the last 3 days. And I hear a lot of partnerships, synergies, concerted action. And I hear a lot about putting the puzzle together and matching. I also hear a lot about matching, like the different strengths and what the partners can bring, but also to find out what the different partners need to be successful. And another thing I hear a lot is evidence. So a lot is about evidence. The different things like what is working where and when and why, but also, and I would like to float again the idea that evidence is not needed only on the innovations, but do they work, and not only on the impact of the innovations, but is needed all along the pathway for scaling so that we can learn and scale quicker and better and more efficient. And I think that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you very much. So we need concrete evidence to underpin transformative change. So that brings me actually to another point. Another question for the panel, and I will get back to the audience again. You know, we did a big facts exercise yesterday, and you know, I think it was a kind of in a way, a kind of a sobering exercise, because when it comes to the facts and the big facts, it's not that, you know, the experts sitting in this room are able to manage and actually know those facts. And if that's accepted, and at the same time, if evidence is needed for policymakers, I mean, to make transformative change, then the question is, where does that leave us? Another big fact that was put forward in the questions yesterday was, you know, how many African countries have explicit adaptation and mitigation targets in their NDCs? And it was only 8 out of 50. Probably, I think we can all agree that when countries start embarking on updating the NDCs, which they have to do because of the agreement of the Paris Agreement, and so over the next 2 years, countries will embark on updating the NDCs. So if we would put ourselves the target that 80%, not 8, but not 8 countries, but that 80% of the African countries, or for that matter, 80% of all countries, would have explicit adaptation and mitigation targets in their NDCs. What would we need to do in order to make that happen? So I put that question to the panel here, and maybe to drive it home, Bess, I mean, since we're in Indonesia, I mean, to get targets in Indonesia's NDCs, or to the extent that there are already targets in Indonesia's NDCs, what can actually be done to make those targets even more ambitious? I mean, you participating in this conference over the last 3 days, I mean, when you go back to Jakarta and you provide feedback to your colleagues and your bosses, and hopefully even also, I mean, your colleagues who were working on the NDCs, on the Indonesia NDC, what would be the message, I mean, that you would be providing to them?
Okay, thank you, Martien. I think I draw up some notes here that first is communication. You know, communication among the institution that taking care of that business. And then the second one is policy. The policy from the country, you know, because in Indonesia, the national focal point is in the Ministry of Forestry and Environment, but we also have a member from other ministry. So communication in those institutes is very important. And the last one is the readiness from the institute. I mean, it really has to be described together, and then also has to be socialized among the stakeholders. And since we have very structural, you know, the center, we also inform them into the district, into the provincial and district, and we have the communication already. They have like 2 times a year meeting, so we will have to communicate to those people, to those person who look after this this calculation on the NDC. Mm-hmm. That's from the Indonesian point of view. Mm-hmm. Even though we already started in 2016, but for the national activity, we need to accelerate more than what we have done before. Thank you.
So, and then to tailor that question a little bit to Andrew, I mean, you as head of a research organization, so if you accept that evidence is needed for transformative change or change at scale, and if it's accepted that the evidence that we have right now, as reflected in the response to the big fact question yesterday, that the evidence is fragmented. I mean, everybody and the experts here know a lot, you know, what's happening in their field. We all see the trees, the question is, how can we bring the forest to bear to the policymakers? So what needs to happen there, in your opinion?
Well, I'll speak here as a delegate to the conference rather than a senior civil servant, if you don't mind. I don't want to see my remarks appearing in the Australian media. I think the trick is getting the mix right between top down and bottom up. If we take Indonesia, it has a national target of 28% reduction by 2030. The target for the energy sector in Indonesia is 1% reduction. And the target for the land sector, agriculture, forestry, land use change, is a 70% reduction. But it's not entirely clear how you would arrive at a 70% reduction by 2030. So the land sector is expected to deliver the big bulk of the Indonesian reduction in emissions. And I think it's terrific having ambition, but if you have a really ambitious target without the building blocks and the stepping stones to get there, then the risk is that you have a disempowering target. So it's a real challenge for the policymakers to have a political ambition matched by policy and a technically feasible pathway. So we are working with a number of countries across the region, including Pacific Island countries that are very poorly resourced, very capable countries like Vietnam, and also partners here in Indonesia, to look at just what are the realistic options within the agriculture and forestry sector and the inventories associated with that, tier 1, tier 2 inventories. And that's where I think that the other event we had here, the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases, that's where GRA has an enormous amount to offer, because different countries are at different points along that journey, and the opportunity to share information about how you get your inventory up to scratch and how you identify the appropriate measures. There's enormous scope for sharing, and that's happening through GRA, and I think there's a tremendous gain to be had there. And we have 58 countries in that collaboration, and that's a really good way of starting to map more viable pathways to those Paris targets. But where countries don't have a very clear target, or they haven't got a roadmap to get there, then you're back in a conventional, how do you influence policy? You need the various interest groups to be bringing the influence they have to bear in a coordinated way, but hopefully with a clear goal in mind. Otherwise, for politicians, they just hear a cacophony of different voices arguing for different interests, and it's not clear where they can achieve the best outcome.
Very good, very good. Ishmael, so 8 countries in Africa have NDC targets for agriculture adaptation and mitigation. How can we move to 40 as part of the NDC updates? I mean, your perspective on what needs to happen in the African context.
To me, I mean, at this level, it's maybe the first time that I'm understanding that only 8 out of 50 is a gap. And if you really talk about those that make governments account, they are essentially the populations and the farmers in general. The question becomes, to what extent is the general population aware of that statistic for them to be able to act on it? Because we don't know that this is the situation. Maybe some don't even care whether it is the situation or not. So I think the first point is to really make the population in general understand of what is at stake here and what is at stake for them, so that they will then put the pressure, which is the evidence that the politicians would want, not necessarily the evidence from researchers. It has to be the evidence from the people who are going to be saying this thing is killing us and you better do something about it. And if you don't do something about it, we shall vote you out of power, so to speak. That is the best pressure. I do accept that evidence from researchers is important to speak to politicians, but there's better evidence mixed with that should come from those that are most affected by what is going to happen or what is anticipated to happen. But without them knowing that this is actually the situation, the language of NDCs is our language. It is not the language of the farmer. It is not the language of the consumer. They don't know about these things. So how do we expect then the general population to make the government's account and to put pressure on them to increase the kind of targets that are required to be increased and to make sure that they speak to the right authorities and parliamentary committees, you name it, that can actually bring to bear on the system to change. So I think that is, we need really to start at the very bottom, apart from the evidence obviously generated by the researchers, to make change much more meaningful and driven from the bottom.
Okay, thank you. So any further ideas from the audience on this aspect of how to scale up, I mean, how countries can include targets, specific targets in the NDCs? Any partnerships that have been formed during this conference that you think can make a difference? Can I see some hands who want to kind of make some contribution? I see one here in front.
Yes, thank you. I would like to make a plea not only to look at agriculture, but also look at other changes that are happening in the system, in our society. And then I think of urbanization and all kind of challenges we have over there. I think if agriculture can connect better to that changing market, then climate smart agriculture could be a part of that.
Okay, thank you. One hand over there at the back, the last one.
Thank you, Sietse Vellema, Wageningen University. Just make a reference to interesting literature maybe on this. There is interesting literature on grassroots innovation movements by IDS Sussex. And maybe referring to the last speaker is that they talk about insertion and mobilization as two processes through which you can scale grassroots innovations. So they try to investigate what are the kind of combination of processes that explain how grassroots movements can in the end also influence mainstream science and technology institutes like CCAFs or the CSA movement. And maybe that's something that connects to the bottom-up voice that you try to express.
Okay, thank you very much. I see a big sign here that time is up, but if you have a few final thoughts, I mean, I will give the opportunity to the panelists. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that last point's a very interesting one. Everyone in this room needs to understand, and I'm sure you do, that agriculture's not alone in this challenge of how we respond to climate change, both in adaptation and mitigation. The decarbonisation of the global economy is the greatest structural change in the human economy ever attempted. And so the energy sector, the transport sector, there are very, very big players across a very wide range of industries that are all grappling with this topic. So we are one part of the picture, a really important part, but we have allies much more broadly. It's not just about, the agricultural value chain. It's really much broader than that. And the response to Greta Thunberg tells us that there's whether it's youth or whether it's civil society, whether it's people who live in apartment blocks in cities or people who live in low-lying coastal areas, there's a huge groundswell of people who are strongly behind what the people in this room are trying to do. So I don't think we should feel as though we're in a small coalition here.
That's a very good point. Bess, any final thoughts from your side?
Maybe I like to draw attention to maybe about the price wise of the agriculture product. Maybe to my understanding, if the price is good enough, so farmers would like to do anything to make their income good by having the good price. I think that's it. Thank you.
So there's need for the business case for farmers.
My final reflections are, the first point for me is this is not the first time that we have been grappling with the issue of scaling up. And there have been many successful scaling ups that has happened before. Not necessarily in agriculture, they may have happened elsewhere. But if we learn lessons as to why there was better scaling up in that particular aspect elsewhere, that we can maybe bring to bear with the issue that we are grappling with. I don't think we have actually gone out to search outside agriculture or within agriculture some of the things that have happened naturally, and they've scaled themselves up sort of autonomously. Maybe there's some reason why it happened like that. Why don't we also do research to go and find out? For instance, the scaling up of the use of mobile telephones, cell phones, it happened, and it had no researcher trying to say there's a hypothesis, let's look at scaling up modality, and it did happen. What is it that the farmers saw in it that made them adopt it without having to be induced to do that? Maybe that's where part of our solutions for scaling up lies, outside our traditional ways of looking at things.
Okay, thank you very much. Time is up, so I hope you found those take-home messages useful. Thank you very much, panel, and please give a hand. Thank you.